There is a phrase that turns up with striking regularity in German wartime testimony from nearly every theater where they faced British and Commonwealth forces. A phrase that says more about the psychology of combat than almost any weapon statistic ever could. Soldiers wrote again and again in letters, in diaries, in post-war interviews conducted decades later that British artillery simply never seemed to miss. Not that it was occasionally accurate, not that it was sometimes devastating, but that it had, in the collective memory of the men who faced it, an almost supernatural quality of precision and inevitability. Understanding why so many hardened, experienced soldiers came away with that particular impression tells us far more about doctrine, training, and the invisible machinery of coordination than it does about any single gun or any single shell. To begin with, it helps to strip away the myth just slightly and look at what British gunners were actually doing differently, because the truth is both more mundane and, in its own way, far more impressive than any notion of magic. British artillery by the middle years of the war had developed a system of what was called predicted fire, a method that allowed guns to hit a target accurately on the very first salvo, without the traditional and telltale process of ranging shots that had defined artillery practice for a century before. Traditionally, gunners fired a shot, observed where it landed, adjusted, fired again, and repeated the process until rounds were falling where they wanted them. This worked, but it gave the enemy fair warning, a few seconds or minutes in which they could see the shells creeping closer and take cover or displace. British artillery, through painstaking survey work, accurate meteorological data, precise calibration of each individual gun's quirks, and careful mapping of targets from aerial photographs and ground observation, learned to skip that warning entirely. The first shell a German soldier heard was very often the shell that was already landing exactly where it needed to. It is not difficult to imagine what that must have felt like from the receiving end. A soldier, crouched in a slit trench, listening to the ordinary sounds of a quiet sector, would suddenly find high explosive detonating precisely on his position, with no preceding ranging rounds to give him even the smallest warning. German veterans interviewed long after the war described this particular quality repeatedly. The sense that the shelling arrived not as a gradually escalating threat, but as something closer to a sudden, perfectly aimed strike from an enemy who seemed to already know exactly where they were standing before a single shot had been fired. One infantryman recalled that his unit had developed an almost superstitious dread of any period of complete quiet along the line because, in his experience, silence from the British guns rarely meant safety. It usually meant they were simply finishing their calculations. Behind this reputation lay an entire system of coordination that most ordinary soldiers on either side never fully saw or understood, but which German officers, studying the pattern of these attacks with increasing alarm, began to piece together over time. British forces had invested heavily in a network of forward observation officers, men who moved with the leading infantry, or rode in reconnaissance vehicles right at the edge of contact, equipped with radios that connected directly back to the guns positioned safely behind the front line. When one of these observers spotted a target, whether a machine gun nest, a column of vehicles, or a concentration of enemy infantry preparing to counterattack, he could call for fire using a standardized rapid system of reporting map references and target descriptions. And within a remarkably short space of time, sometimes only a couple of minutes, an entire battery or even a full regiment of guns could bring concentrated fire down onto that exact spot. This was not the work of a single brilliant gunner, but the product of an entire chain of specialists, surveyors, meteorologists, signalers, and calculators, all functioning together as a single coordinated system, rather than a collection of individual guns firing more or less independently. German artillery of the same period was, in many respects, technically excellent, and no honest account of the war pretends otherwise. German gunners were skilled, their equipment well engineered, and there are plenty of instances where German artillery fire proved just as devastating as anything the British could produce. But the underlying system supporting it often lacked the same depth of coordinated infrastructure, particularly as the war ground on and fuel replacement equipment and trained specialists all became increasingly scarce. German soldiers who had served on multiple fronts sometimes wrote with a kind of professional curiosity about just how quickly the British seemed able to shift massed fire from one target to another, describing it almost as though the enemy artillery behaved like a single flexible weapon, rather than dozens of separate guns each requiring individual orders. One officer, comparing his own experience of calling for support with what he had observed of British methods from captured documents and prisoner interrogations, wrote that requesting artillery support on his own side often felt like sending a letter and waiting for a reply, whereas the British approach felt closer to a live conversation where the response came back almost as fast as the request went out. This sense of an almost conversational speed becomes especially clear when looking at accounts from Normandy in the summer of 1944, where the density of British artillery support reached levels that shocked even veteran German units who had fought on other fronts, including the Eastern Front, where artillery bombardments were hardly unfamiliar. Soldiers defending the tightly contested hedgerow country south of Caen described concentrations of fire that seemed to appear almost instantly whenever German infantry or armor attempted to move, even under cover of darkness or poor visibility. A Panzer Grenadier recalled attempting a modest local counterattack against what appeared to be a lightly held British position, only for the advance to be broken apart within minutes by artillery fire so precisely placed that his unit initially assumed the British must have somehow already known the attack was coming. In fact, what had likely happened was simpler and, in its own way, more unsettling. A forward observer embedded close to the front line and constantly scanning for exactly this kind of movement had spotted the assembly of German troops before the attack even began, and had guns already laid onto the most likely approach routes well in advance, ready to fire the moment movement was confirmed. This anticipatory quality, guns already prepared before the target even fully presented itself, appears again and again in German accounts, and it points to something important about how British artillery doctrine actually worked. Rather than simply reacting to threats as they appeared, British gunnery staff spent considerable effort trying to predict where German forces were likely to move, concentrate, or counterattack, preparing fire plans in advance so that when the moment came, the response felt instantaneous rather than improvised. Soldiers on the receiving end had no way of seeing this preparation happening behind the scenes. All they experienced was the effect, fire that seemed to know where they would be before they themselves had quite finished deciding to be there. Prisoners captured during and after these engagements gave interrogators a remarkably consistent picture when asked directly about their experience of British artillery, and these interrogation reports preserved in post-war archives echo the private diary entries almost word for word. Several captured officers described what they called, in their own phrasing, a felt sense of being permanently observed, an unease that persisted even in quiet periods, because experience had taught them that the absence of visible enemy activity meant nothing about whether they were actually being watched. One senior NCO, describing a lengthy defensive stand near the Normandy bocage, told his interrogator that his men had stopped bothering to whisper theories about British reconnaissance methods and had simply adopted an operating assumption that any position occupied for more than a few hours would eventually draw fire, regardless of how well it had been camouflaged. That kind of psychological adjustment, soldiers essentially conceding the argument before the enemy had even properly opened fire, speaks volumes about how deeply this reputation for uncanny accuracy had embedded itself into German military thinking by the middle of the war. It is worth pausing to consider how much of this reputation, while grounded in real technical superiority in several important respects, was also amplified by the ordinary psychology of combat itself. Soldiers under sustained bombardment often overestimate the precision and coordination of the fire falling on them, partly because a shell that lands close by feels intensely personal and deliberate, even when a degree of it may owe something to chance or to broader area targeting rather than pinpoint accuracy on a single soldier. Military historians examining these accounts alongside British gunnery records have generally concluded that the underlying system truly was exceptionally capable, among the most sophisticated and effective of the entire war, but that its reputation among German troops also grew through repetition, through soldiers passing stories to each other, through the simple human tendency to remember the terrifying near misses far more vividly than the shells that fell harmlessly elsewhere. The myth and the reality reinforced one another, each making the other feel more certain, until British artillery had become, in the collective imagination of German infantry across multiple fronts, something close to an inescapable, almost omniscient presence on the battlefield. Yet, strip away the psychological amplification and there remains a hard technical core that fully justified much of that fear. British gunnery officers had, through years of methodical development stretching back well before the war, built an approach that treated artillery not as a blunt instrument to be fired roughly in the general direction of the enemy, but as a precisely calibrated system where every variable, barrel wear, propellant temperature, wind speed, even the curvature of the earth over longer ranges, was accounted for mathematically before a single shell left the barrel. This obsessive attention to calculation, unglamorous and largely invisible to the soldiers actually pulling the lanyards, was precisely what allowed that first uncannily accurate salvo to land exactly where it needed to, again and again, across different battles, different terrain, and different weather conditions. German soldiers experiencing the results of this quiet, methodical calculation had no way of seeing the surveyors, the meteorological officers, or the calculation staff working behind the lines. They only ever saw and felt the outcome, and it is hardly surprising that outcome came to feel, from where they were standing, like something close to inevitability itself. There is another dimension to this reputation that deserves attention, one rooted not in any single dramatic engagement, but in the sheer relentlessness with which British gunners pursued what was known as counter-battery fire. The deliberate hunting down and destruction of the enemy's own artillery before it could do serious damage. German gun crews understandably considered themselves relatively safe when positioned well behind their own front lines, out of range of small arms and often out of direct observation from advancing infantry. British sound, ranging, and flash spotting units, however, specialized precisely in locating hidden batteries through nothing more than the sound and light signature of their own firing, triangulating positions with remarkable accuracy, using microphones and observation posts spread across the front. a German battery commander who fired his guns more than a handful of times from the same position, particularly if his shots followed any kind of predictable pattern, stood a genuine risk of receiving devastating counterfire within a surprisingly short window, sometimes less than an hour after his own guns had opened up. Several diaries and post-war accounts from German artillerymen describe this specific fear, the sense that firing their own guns was itself an act of exposure, a signal flare, announcing their position to an unseen listener who was already calculating exactly where to send a reply. One gun position officer recalled relocating his battery no fewer than 4 times in a single week, purely out of anxious anticipation of counter-battery fire that, more often than not, arrived regardless of how carefully the position had been chosen or camouflaged. This hunter and hunted dynamic reshaped how German artillery crews approached their own work throughout the middle and later years of the war, often forcing choices that quietly undermined their own effectiveness even before a single British shell landed near them. Batteries that might otherwise have fired sustained heavy concentrations against advancing British infantry instead adopted a pattern of short, sharp bursts, followed immediately by displacement to a new position, sacrificing volume and sustained pressure purely to survive the counter-battery response they had learned to expect. It is a striking irony that emerges from these accounts, that German artillery, in some respects a genuinely formidable weapon in its own right, found its full potential blunted not primarily by direct assault, but by the constant gnawing knowledge that any prolonged use of it would summon a swift and often lethal reply from an enemy whose location, unlike their own, felt maddeningly difficult to pin down in return. The wireless network underpinning all of this deserves its own moment of attention, because without it, none of the speed or precision described above would have been remotely possible. British forward observers carried compact radio sets that connected them not merely to their own battery but, when required, into a wider net capable of summoning fire from multiple regiments simultaneously, a capability that came to be informally known among gunners by names such as a Mike target for a full regiment's worth of guns, or larger still, an uncle target drawing in the fire of an entire divisional artillery grouping, all directed at a single point identified by one man, crouched somewhere near the front line with little more than a map, a compass, and a radio handset. German intelligence officers who studied captured British signals procedures came away with genuine respect and no small measure of alarm at just how quickly and reliably this system could concentrate overwhelming firepower onto a single map reference. A captured German artillery liaison officer, questioned after his capture in Normandy, reportedly told his interrogators that his own side simply had nothing directly comparable in terms of the sheer speed with which such a request could be processed and answered, and that German procedures, while thorough and carefully worked out on paper, tended to involve more layers of confirmation and authorization that inevitably slowed the entire process down compared with what he had personally witnessed of British methods during the fighting. It is easy, looking back from a distance of many decades, to reduce all of this to abstract technical description, survey data, calibration tables, wireless procedure. But for the individual German soldier crouched in a foxhole or sheltering behind a hedgerow, none of that technical machinery was visible or even comprehensible in the moment. What he experienced instead was something far simpler and far more visceral: silence, followed without warning by devastating, perfectly placed fire, followed by silence again, over and over, until the pattern itself began to feel less like a military tactic and more like a force of nature that had somehow learned to aim. Soldiers who survived multiple such bombardments across different campaigns often described developing a kind of heightened, almost paranoid alertness that never fully switched off even during rest periods well behind the line, a lingering low-grade dread that the guns, wherever they were, already knew roughly where the next target would be. There is a particular story, recounted by more than one veteran in post-war interviews, and worth including here, precisely because of how ordinary and human it is, describing a group of German soldiers who had taken to timing exactly how long it took British guns to respond after they lit cooking fires at dusk, a small daily ritual that had, over a period of weeks, become an unspoken test of the enemy's reach and patience. For a time, nothing happened, and the soldiers began to relax slightly, believing perhaps that this particular position had genuinely gone unnoticed. Then, without warning one evening, a short, precise concentration of fire landed almost exactly on their cooking area within minutes of the fires being lit. A stark and frightening reminder that the apparent quiet of previous weeks had not meant safety at all, but simply patience, observation, and the accumulation of exactly the kind of positional data that British gunners specialized in gathering before finally choosing to act. Taken together, these accounts, official interrogation reports, private diaries, post-war interviews, and the technical records kept by British gunnery units themselves paint a picture that is remarkably consistent across theaters, across years, and across ranks. German soldiers did not believe British artillery never missed because of any single dramatic incident or isolated stroke of luck. They believed it because that impression was built, shell by shell, position by position, through a genuinely superior system of coordination, calculation, and communication that turned what might otherwise have been a straightforward technical contest between two competent artillery arms into something that felt, from the receiving end, closer to an inescapable and almost personal form of attention. That reputation, earned through unglamorous patient work rather than any single spectacular victory, proved in its own quiet way to be one of the most effective weapons the British Army fielded throughout the entire war, not because it destroyed every single target it aimed at, which of course it did not, but because it convinced an entire enemy army, position after position, front after front, that resistance against it was very often simply a matter of time. By the later stages of the war, this reputation had become so deeply ingrained that some German commanders openly factored it into their own planning, choosing to avoid certain types of movement or concentration specifically because they anticipated an artillery response they knew, from painful experience, would likely arrive faster and more accurately than anything their own gunners could produce in reply. That kind of behavioral change, an enemy quietly altering its own tactics simply out of respect for what your artillery might do to them, represents perhaps the clearest evidence of just how effective this system truly was. It was never really about any single gun being unusually powerful, nor any single gunner being unusually gifted. It was about an entire chain of quiet, methodical, often thankless work. Surveyors plotting coordinates, meteorologists tracking wind, signalers relaying coordinates within seconds, and forward observers watching patiently for the smallest sign of movement, all functioning together so smoothly that the men on the receiving end could be forgiven for believing they were facing something that simply never missed.